the questions I had to actually sort myself out, I had to look at what was going wrong in our interventions. They seemed perfectly acceptable. You looked at an average increase in the Quality First classroom, and it would be a reading age of 3 months across a term. But quite often what we were having is staff misunderstanding. There was often a focus of a training need. An intervention didn't specifically meet the need of a student, or there was too many needs, and it was which need did you address first. There was also the question of cost versus impact, resources, time, intervention versus lesson time, staff resistance, as well as student resistance. So there was an awful lot that I had to consider when I was looking at putting together this intervention. So if you just go on to the next slide, some of the biggest problems that I actually anticipated was a lack of buy-in for staff and pupils. So students would come out for maybe an hour each week for a literacy intervention. Quite often they would come out of non-core subjects such as art or PE, and if they were done on a carousel, it meant these students were absent for quite a lot of a series of learning. So staff would forget to send students through to their intervention. Students wouldn't want to go because they would be taken out of a subject where they could experience some success. And so I had to think about it and turn it on its head. I also felt one of the issues of the traditional literacy intervention was the fact that children couldn't see their progress because it was minimal and incremental across week by week. They couldn't see that they were having any sort of sense of experiencing success, and they couldn't take it back into the classroom because they couldn't see the link between the two. So what I found, there was a massive disconnect between the intervention content, the lesson content, and increasing pupil and staff engagement. So what I looked at is changing the timetable. I changed my whole approach, and I decided to do an intensive, which meant I was taking students off of timetable for 6 weeks at a time, but they were only coming off of the core subjects. They were coming off from English and quite often history, because that was the most of the subjects they had in quantity, and they couldn't access those particular lessons anyway. Now, this was a totally different way of thinking, and I had to do a very strong rationale to get buy-in from, at the time I actually put this in place, I wasn't an AVP, I was a literacy coordinator, so I had to manage up, I had to manage my peers, and I had to manage staff and TAs in order to get them on side. So what we did is we did this intensive for 6 weeks. They came off English, they came off history, and they were removed from the core. It increased the engagement. It meant that staff knew they were missing a block of learning in terms of the scheme of learning, which was quite often done across 6 weeks. They preferred that because it minimised disruption of students coming in and out. Everyone knew where they were up to, and there was a very clear link between the intensive delivery and the schemes of learning missed. So students could see the crossover. They could also experience that success. In my previous school, the reason it started is when I was looking for students, they'd quite often be under the stairwell, and it's because they were avoiding going to lesson, or they were avoiding their literacy intervention because it had a huge stigma around it as well. In my previous school, the reading ages were white working class predominantly, but with reading ages as low as 6. Now, for a high school, that is really, really difficult, and I think it's above and beyond what a lot of staff felt they were able to differentiate for. So for me, it made sense to pull students for 6 weeks out of those core. Now, traditionally, as I say, students have always been taken out of non-core for as long as I can remember. I had a lot of resistance. I was very lucky and I managed to sell the rationale. It was very, very clear what I was going to do in this across this 6 weeks. And I had a vice principal to support me to do a pilot. Because we did the pilot initially, and if anyone was going to try this, I would suggest you pick very carefully in terms of the students you identify. I've done the same again in my current setting, which is very, very different. It's very multicultural. But here, my current setting had a scattergun approach. There was too many needs. They were doing a fantastic job, but they were having up to 200 students a week on interventions. And it was very difficult to pull out which interventions were working effectively and which ones didn't have the same impact. So we never quite knew where those gains were being made.